is based on role-based provisioning. GCA and Microfocus would like to join you today well, thank you for joining us on this webinar today. Our webinar presenter today is Robert Ivy. Robert has worked in identity and security for more than a decade as part of the GCA team. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to him, and he'll take it from here.
Thanks, Damon. I'm going to start. What I'm going to do is mute everyone in the meeting just to make sure there's no background noise and things like that. And then if anybody needs to ask a question, just go ahead and unmute to ask a question. Or you can ask it in the chat. I'm also pretty easygoing, so if you want to, if you have a question, while we're in a slide or something pops in your head, go ahead and ask it in the chat, and I'll try to answer the questions as they come in. Or if you want to, you could just wait all the way to the end. That's fine as well. So I'm Robert Ivy. I'm the Chief Technical Officer here at GCA, and as Damon said, I've been doing identity and access management for a few minutes. Kind of good at it. And over the years, we've done a lot of strategies as it comes to roles-based provisioning in order to help with regulatory compliance and operational efficiency and other needs for organizations. And I'm just going to go over at a high level some of the strategies that we implement in order to help organizations essentially become much more efficient and compliant by leveraging roles-based provisioning and roles-based user access reviews. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So a quick overview of GCA. Identity and access management is a pretty big space. Many people define it in a different way. This pinwheel, which is part of our logo, we try to kind of define all the different items that we consider to be around in the identity space, and then this is also where we specialize. Our core value, our mission statement, is that we enable and secure access to business data by managing your digital identities. So we're not one of those organizations that's trying to do everything under the sun. Our core goal and everything we do is focused around enabling and securing access to business data by managing digital identities. So we've been around since 1986. We are very client focused. And I like to think that we've got quite a few NetIQ identity management ninjas on our staff. We've got quite a few people who've been doing specifically the NetIQ IDM product and suite of products around identity and access management. I want to say we're up to 5 or 6 people now who've been doing it for as long or longer than I have, of over a decade. So we're pretty darn good at it nowadays. One of the first things I'd like to start with, because we did, when we were talking about this webinar, it does have a lot to do with operational efficiency, and everything ultimately boils down to dollar figures. So the Burton Group, who's down there at the bottom, we had pulled some statistics from Burton Group about the average cost to manually change items in a directory, as well as the average cost per password reset request. And then we try to extrapolate it out. So this is this is actually an Excel spreadsheet that we use in order to help determine what the overall cost of an organization is to manually manage the data. Because one of the things that we do with identity management systems and the identity lifecycle management process is that we synchronize the data between the different systems. So all of these costs related to modifications of a user's information in an end system, as well as password resets, part of the NetIQ identity management suite, if implemented correctly, should eliminate or greatly reduce those costs. And of course, this is just an example of an organization, of a pseudo organization. We would go in and actually change and tweak these numbers. But this is how we do this is one of the methods that we do as a return on investment calculation to determine whether or not it makes sense to automate provisioning into specific applications. This next slide is a diagram that I've been pulling forward for over 10 years. I'm not sure exactly who made it, otherwise I would give them credit. This slide has been around in a few different iterations for at least a decade. I love this slide because it's the best, I think it's the best visual representation of a user's identity lifecycle within an organization. So up in the top left, up here, is the onboarding process where you enter into what I call the pinwheel, right? So you enter into the pinwheel whenever you have a relationship, whatever that relationship may be. You could be a partner, you could be a customer, you could be an employee, a contractor, whatever it may be. But when you enter into a relationship with the organization, you come in to some sort of an onboarding process. Now, as you maintain your relationship at the organization, different life cycle events can potentially happen. You could be promoted, you could move to a new location, you could be assigned a project, you could go on vacation and forget your password, at which point you have to reset it, or every 45, 90, 60, whatever the policy is, your password expires and you have to set a new one. These are very common events that occur during regular life cycle. And then, of course, the day-to-day activities of accessing resources, which has single sign-on and access management. In this webinar, what we're talking about here covers everything in this pinwheel with the exception of accessing resources. It's not that we don't do that. It's just that section in and of itself is a large enough topic that I could talk about it for a few hours. So we explicitly excluded that from this particular conversation. But when someone enters a relationship, they can then go through typical life cycle events. And then at some point, whether you retire or you move on to a new organization, your relationship with the organization is going to end and you're going to leave. We're going to deprovision your access. So moving on. Why roles? This is actually a specific example. We had a client that this is actually what it looks like. I'm not going to mention who they are, but they are a healthcare organization. And what would happen is, well, it's very simple. They have a new person who creates a relationship with one of their hospitals, and when that relationship begins, that physician needs access to log into Cerner. Cerner is one of the leading EMR, EHR, I can never remember the difference between the two, but it's one of the leading applications that's used, and this particular hospital used it. So what would happen is a very simple question would be posed. Hey, we have a new physician, please give them access to Cerner. Well, that's simple enough, right? So we go and we provision them in Cerner, we're done. Well, it's not quite that simple. Because, okay, cool, request is done. Now the physician's sitting here saying, how do I even log into this thing, right? Because they need credentials. Cerner authenticates against Active Directory in most organizations that I've seen. So you have to have a network account in order to even log in. All right, cool. So we request a network account. All right, now they have their credentials and they can log in, but how do they get to how do they log into Cerner? What do I dial up in my browser? Where do I get the Cerner client? Oh, well, you're remote. The Cerner client's only available to internal employees. Let's get you an MFA account and a VPN account so that you can VPN into our network. Okay, that ticket gets completed. We give them, whatever token we're using for MFA. We provision that. We give it out to them. Now they're sitting on whatever computer they're at. They are VPN'd into our network. They have an account in Cerner. They have a network account. They can log in, right? Wrong. Cerner is a fat client-based application, and this particular organization delivers that fat client via Citrix presentation server, or whatever they call the Citrix stuff now. I think they got away from presentation server. Been doing this for too long. I still remember the old names. Okay, I can't log into Citrix. Let me open up another ticket. I need to log into Citrix. Ticket gets closed. I am now able to log into Citrix. I go to citrix.client.com and I log in. And I'm supposed to see an icon in order for me to launch. That icon is not there. Let me open another ticket. Hey, I'm logged into Citrix. I don't see the Cerner icon. Okay. And as you can see, this process kind of iterates through because there's all of these different prerequisites. Something as simple as logging into one of our applications has so many different prerequisites in order for me to even get there. And I, as a physician, I don't know what to ask for. So what do we do about that? Let's use roles. So I created a very simple example of a role, right? If I have a new physician who starts at my organization, right, and they need access to Cerner, instead of specifically asking for cerner access and only getting cerner access, let me ask for the role, because a role can contain more than one thing, right? So what I've done now is I've said, all right, here's the cerner access here at the top, right? Anybody who's familiar with cerner, there's a position and then there's various groups and all that type of stuff. We're not going into that level of detail here. We can if anybody wants to, but that access is included here at the top. But then also underneath it, we've included some children, right? Because in order to log into Citrix, you need a network account. Or I'm sorry, in order to log into cerner, you need a Citrix account or a network account. You need access to the Citrix server, and you need a specific group that'll make that icon appear for you. So what we've done now is we've kind of taken all of the different individual granular items that you need in order for a person to log into that application, and we've bundled all of the prerequisites underneath it, right? So that when we ask for cerner physician access and we get the necessary approvals, when it comes back, it's going to make sure that it also provisions a network account. It's going to give that network account access to Citrix, and it's going to give that network account or that Citrix account access to the icon that is displayed. Now, when I get cerner access, it will also make sure that all of these other things that I need are done. In this instance, instead of making 4 separate requests and having to troubleshoot and stumble our way through, I made one request, and after I got all the approvals on one request, everything necessary was done. Now, there's one thing missing from this request. This was a remote physician. So let's do a more advanced one that also has remote. One of the beautiful things about roles is that they can be nested within each other. So now, the example that we had before is nested underneath. So the cerner physician remote access contains all of the accesses of regular cerner physician, but also includes all of the remote access requirements as well. So in order for a remote employee to access the corporate network, they need a network account, multi-factor account, and a VPN account, because they have to VPN, provide multi-factor authentication in order to get onto our network. So what we've done is we've taken those 2 roles. Here's the role that contains cerner access here at the top, and here's the role down here that contains all of the items that we need to remotely access the network. We took all of them, put them together, and called them one thing. This is a remote physician access to cerner. Now, one request is made, and after all the approvals and everything are done, they get access to cerner, a network account, Citrix, the icon within Citrix. Notice how the network account is duplicated, right? Because you need a network account for both remote access and physician access. That is intentional. You also get your multi-factor account and your VPN account all set up for you. The beauty of the duplication is both of these child roles, the cerner physician access and the remote access, both require the network access. So if this cerner remote physician gets hired on full-time, is now working at one of my hospitals, they may not necessarily need remote anymore. We could take away this bottom section, remote, go back to the previous role that was on the previous slide back here, back to this, but they'll still have the network account because they had it for 2 reasons. They had the network account for this and for this. And the system is smart enough to know, don't take it away if you still need it. So once again, we go back to, in this example, there's now 7 items that we bundled. So if you go back to that big long list and all the troubleshooting that was going on in order to figure it out, all of that was bundled into a single request where one person could ask for one thing, and all the 6 other things that are needed to make that access happen are obfuscated from the user, so they don't know that they're asking for them, but we from an IT perspective know that they require them in order to do it. That is one of the benefits of using roles and day-to-day operations of an organization. Now that we've talked about how we can define roles, let's now kind of slide over to how, after we've defined roles such as these, how do we use them in day-to-day life? Because the use of roles and the power of how we use roles, it's not just for I need this, get approval, and provision all this stuff. There's other ways that we can use them. So let's start with the anatomy of the business process. Right? So like any other business process, it's pretty straightforward. Every single step that's done in this process does not necessarily have to be done with software, but like everything else, we use software in order to gain operational efficiencies and eliminate human error. So the first part of the process, and there's only three, when we do an access request, first we're going to do the request itself. Then we're going to make sure that we have all the appropriate approvals on the request. The approvals part is very important when you get into things like regulatory compliance. When you're dealing with HIPAA, SOX, PCI, or any of the other regulatory compliance and the associated control frameworks, every single one of them asks a very simple question. You have that access. Who said it was okay? Who approved it? And then finally, after the approval's done, we move into fulfillment. Now, when we're talking about identity management or identity lifecycle management, and we're dealing with tools such as NetIQ Identity Manager, everybody thinks of automated, right? Let's automate the process of provisioning an Active Directory account. Let's automate the process of provisioning an account in Discerner. What people typically skip or miss is the fact that we can also still do manual fulfillment. So if I have an organization that has 50 applications, there's a pretty good chance that 40 of the 50 applications we haven't automated provisioning to them yet because we haven't set up the connectors, or it doesn't make business sense for us to connect them because it'll cost too much money to connect the application and it has such a low change rate that we'll never actually realize a return on our investment. We don't have to automate everything. If we have an application that we only have 5 people that get provisioned and deprovisioned from it every year, there's no sense in automating provisioning to it. However, we could still do the first 2 steps. We could still use requests. We could still get approvals for them for regulatory compliance instead of our reporting piece. But then we could just open a ticket over an ITSM and say, hey, whatever team it is that provisions it, hey, this is approved. Please go provision it for the user, right? Let's keep the manual process of provisioning because we don't have a connector. Either it doesn't make sense or we haven't built it yet. We haven't gotten there. But let's keep the team running and we'll just take over the other 2 steps very quickly. And if you break down the anatomy of these, a user access request can be done in 3 ways. We call them the 3 R's of a request, right? The first one is role. And a role is what we were talking about. It's where you bundle a bunch of things together as one and you ask just for it. A bundle. The second one is a request. That's oftentimes, people will call it workflow as well. That comes into play when you can't easily find exactly what you want. As an example, if there are too many possible permutations of access for an application, then maybe we want to do a workflow. That way the workflow can guide through what the specific access you're requesting is. And so when we create that request, we don't have to search a catalog of 10 million items to find the specific one that's exactly what we want. We can ask some simple questions of the user, and as they answer the questions, it'll determine what their access should be. And then the third one, which is what I as a computer science nerd love, is rule. Rule is logic. This is where we can programmatically make decisions for the business in order to do very large, broad brush strokes and cover large percentages of your requirements all at once. For example, every employee gets this stuff. Well, that's pretty easy to implement with a rule. If you are a full-time employee of the organization, let's ask HR, the answer to that is yes, we're going to automatically do this. No human interaction required. After we've made a request, we need to go into an approval form. We don't want to do anything without approvals. And, well, we can in some cases. But we want to make sure that the appropriate stakeholders within our business say it's okay before we provision access. So the first type is none. That's pretty easy, right? So if I don't have whatever that role or entitlement or resource or whatever it is, if I don't have an approval attached to it, or if I don't have an approver attached to it, we can automatically approve it. Hey, I would like to join the ping pong distribution list because there's avid ping pong lovers in my company, and we have a distribution list so that we can, have ping pong meetups and do all that type of stuff. There's no reason anyone in the business needs to approve me being in that group. If I want in, I'm in. If I want out, I'm out. No approval required, just do it. Then there's specific approvers, right? So we are using a tool called Blue Jeans to do this webinar. I, as the CTO of GCA, I actually don't have access to Blue Jeans normally. The person who controls the Blue Jeans account is Damon Ebanks, the person who introduced himself at the beginning of this call. So when I asked for access to Blue Jeans, Damon had to approve it. Yes, Robert's allowed to have access to Blue Jeans because he's giving this webinar today. That is a specific approver, because no matter who's asking, Damon is the right person to approve. The third type of approval is relative. If I were to ask for something and my manager needs to approve it, or the VP of finance for my division of the company, or something like that, my manager is not necessarily the same as the next person's manager. That's a relative approval. Who the approver is gets determined when the time comes. So in this case, my approver would be Jim Quashis, the president and CEO. That's my direct report. However, if I had, for example, one of my engineers, Dan Southard, make the same exact request, I would be the approver because I'm his manager, etc. And then finally, we go to fulfillment, which, as we covered before, there's really two ways. There's automated, because the system knows how to provision the access, so it just goes and does it. Or there's manual, where it takes the work and it uses some integration with some other system to say, hey, please go do this stuff, please. Although there's too many pleases in that statement, but that's the general idea. This is another slide that I've been carrying over for years, and I don't know who to give credit to. But I think it's a great slide because ultimately, in the Venn diagram, you can have combinations of different types of requests, right? So roles are at the top, and RBAC stands for Roles-Based Access Control. So RBAC is sometimes an acronym that people use to refer to as roles. Optimum effectiveness is when you have some combination of the three different types. So you have three different types of ways of asking for access, right? So we cover the three types. There's the roles-based, the request-based or workflow-based, and then the automated-based or rules-based. 3 R's: roles, request, and rules, and roles. So as we go through, we can do any combination. So I have a couple examples of different combinations. So one that I've alluded to. Here at GCA, we use mostly cloud applications, but every single person in my organization who gets onboarded, every single one of them, give them a network account. We use G Suite for email and productivity, right? So you got to have a G Suite, otherwise you don't get email. We use Box.com for file systems, so we've got to give you a Box account, otherwise you can't access the file shares. In order to use PowerPoint, Excel, Word, etc., you need an Office 365 account. That's your subscription that allows you to use the Office suite. And then we use a cloud-based phone system called Ring Central. So in order for me to give you an extension so that you have a phone and everything like that, not everybody gets an actual physical phone. I'm a perfect example of that. I don't use a physical phone. I use a virtual phone. But everybody does get an extension within the phone system. So what I've done here is I've created a kind of a construct over here on the left of what that role looks like. Every single person who's an employee of my company gets all 5 of those items. If you're an employee, you get them. So what I've done here is I've done a combination of things. I've used a role in order to create a construct. Those 5 different accounts get bundled together as a single role. So now only one request needs to be made. So now I went from 5 down to 1. So I don't need to go in and say, hey, please provision my new employee all these different accounts. But then the other thing that I've done is I've gone over to Jim Quashis, who's the president and CEO, and I've said, hey, Jim, are you okay with me automatically granting every single person who gets hired by GCA one of these accounts? Now, that's not elevated rights or specific rights, just they get an account in the system because they're an employee, because every employee gets it. And Jim signs off and says, yes, Robert, we can do that. What we've done is we've combined role and rule, so that now the rule makes it to where, if you follow a little flow chart that's down here at the bottom in the blue, when I have a new person who starts, are they an employee? If the answer is yes, automatically request that role. Done. So when I hire a new employee, because Jim Quasha says it's okay, it automatically requests it. But because Jim's already signed off on it in a blanket statement, it also has no approvals necessary. Every single person who gets hired as an employee will automatically be granted that role, which expands out to those 5 different accounts. And I, as a manager, I don't have to do anything, right? I don't need Jim to sign off. I don't need anybody to sign off. If I have automated provisioning, I don't need anybody from IT to go in and take action because it'll automatically provision the accounts. So what are my benefits, right? As a manager, it's pretty simple, right? I've got a new employee who's starting. I don't have to run around and create a bunch of requests to ask for their account. In fact, I don't have to create a single one. All of the items got consolidated into a single request, and because I'm integrated over to HR and I have a rule, it automatically requests it on my behalf. But then because Jim has pre-authorized it, I don't need anybody to approve it. So when my HR department goes in and keys in and says, hey, we're hiring a new person, Joe Smith, and they put him in, they put in all their information, when the identity management system looks into the HR system and says, oh, there's a new employee, it's just going to run off and deploy and essentially provision those accounts right then and there. I don't have to wait. So what if I'm on vacation the week before that person starts? You're not waiting for me. What if one of my approvers is on vacation? What if the person from IT who knows how to provision accounts into Ring Central, right, the phone guy, what happens if that person's on vacation? I don't have to do any waiting here. There's no human involvement. We've programmatically put into the tool our business process and our business policies. We've evaluated the policies as part of the process and taken action. And now the robots are running the show. The other benefits are a very common one. Now, when my employee starts, all of their access is already ready to go because we integrated over to HR. So when the HR department keyed them in today and their start date is on Monday, the system will automatically provision all of their accounts and have them ready to go so that 8 a.m. on Monday morning, when that new employee walks in the door, all I have to do is hand them the employee onboarding email that I get as the manager. I print it out and hand it to them. It has their initial credential and the steps that they need, and they can walk through the entire process of setting up all of their accounts and getting to them and move right into training. We've had organizations where we've done case studies that take the average that we've seen is approximately 3 weeks. So from the time that a new employee starts on Monday morning, they don't have all of their access situated, logical access to all the systems they need in order to be productive in their job role. On average, 3 weeks. That is 15 business days, 120 working hours is what it's taking. So you have an employee for the first 3 weeks of their tenure at your organization. For every new employee, on average, they are not able to be fully productive 3 weeks. That's insane. What we've done here is we've given a construct that allows us to go to the authoritative source. HR knows when somebody's hired and knows what job function they're supposed to do. We should be able to take their access, provision it for them, have it waiting for them, so that on day 1 or day 0, that's why we like to call it 0-day start, the moment they walk in the door, their access is ready. The only reason why they can't be productive is because they don't know how to use the tools yet, which is a training exercise, not an identity and access management provisioning problem. Let's go into just a little bit more advanced use case, right? So we talked about, once again, if we go back, there's the three different types here. So what we just did was a combination of role here at the top and rule over here on the left. So we're somewhere in this little red tent area here. I'm going to give an example of one that actually implements all three. That's the next example. So what happens when we have a new person start, and we're going to go back to our hospital example, and they're a physician, right? Now, we can obviously grant the employee access because they're an employee. They'll still do that whole process. And a user can have more than one role. That's a misnomer that some people have is, oh, there's only one role per person. No, that is not the case. You can have as many roles as you want. In this case, though, we have a prerequisite. Before we can provision you the Cerner physician access, we need to make sure that you have a valid NPI. NPI, for those not familiar with healthcare organizations, it's a National Physician Identification Number or something like that. It's an identification number that is used for physicians, and then there's their license. Each state has different license requirements depending on, if this is a physician who has access to e-prescribe, maybe they're able to prescribe narcotics, they need to have a license number. So that is a regulatory compliance requirement. We want to make sure we don't violate that. So we don't want to get ahead of ourselves and run off and request that physician role and give that person access before we're sure that we have a valid physician identification number as well as a valid license in the state that they're doing. What we're going to do in this case is we're going to we have a rule, right? A new person starts here at the top. Are they a physician? Yes. There's our rule. Physician, yes or no. But then when it's yes, we're actually going to kick off a workflow. And the workflow is going to say, do we know their NPI number and their license number, and is their license valid? So we're going to put some logic in there. If we don't have the data we need in order to meet our regulatory requirements to provision their access into the system where there's potentially the capability to e-prescribe, we're going to stop and we're going to collect the necessary data. So we're going to assign to someone within the organization, whatever department that is, hey, I have a physician, Joe Smith, that's starting. They need to be able to e-prescribe. We need you to go collect their information, input into whatever system is necessary, and then attest that it is valid and ready to go. And give us the day, maybe, that the license expires so that we can revoke this access when they're no longer allowed to have it. So how do we do that? After the rule determines, yes, you're a physician, and started the workflow says, do I have the information? If the answer is no, we assign that, whoever the person within the organization is, we assign it to them and say, hey, you need to go validate this, please. After they've validated it and we're done, then it will kick off the process to request the role. If there's approvers that are involved in there, maybe this isn't a birthright role, maybe it does require approvers, or maybe it's a birthright role that still requires approvers. That's okay. We'll run off and get all the approvers if they're necessary, and then they have the access, and then we're good to go. So what we've done here is we've used a rule to determine they're a physician. We've used a workflow to determine whether or not we have all the necessary data to give them the access, and then we used a role to bundle up all the different access that is prerequisite to getting them into the Cerner system. We've put all that together nice and neat, delivered it with a pretty bow, and the entire business process has been automated inside of a workflow tool. And every step of this workflow tool is audited so that we can provide it back to a regulatory, maybe internal or external audit wants to look at this for regulatory compliance purposes. The next step. So we've seen the three different ones for how to do requests. Let's talk briefly about the approval patterns, right? We touched on them at a high level, but just go through them again. After the request is made, there's three different approval types, and you can do some combinations here. Obviously, none doesn't get combined with anything because none is an auto-approve. Just like the example, and on this slide, my example is charity event distribution list. So at GCA, there's an initiative that we have that we like to donate back to the communities in which we work. If people want to know what it is that we're doing, there's a distribution list at GCA. That distribution list says, here's the stuff we're doing. We do announcements on that. If people are interested on that, it is an optional distribution list. It does not require any approval. You can jump in it at will, and you don't need anybody to say yes or no or anybody to do the work. It just does it. It's a better example, I think, than the ping pong group, actually. Then there's specific, right? So this goes back to, hey, we have one director of finance. So if the director of finance if there's only one, then cool, it goes to that person, or maybe it's a group, and then that way, if the director of finance changes, we just modify who's in the group. Maybe, back to my example with Blue Jeans, Damon, a specific individual, or maybe we send it to a group, right? The leadership team. So the leadership team compromises of a few people. Maybe one person in the leadership team just needs to say it's okay. Those are all very specific groups of people. They don't change based on who's asking or who it's for. Relative is where it changes. So if we go back to the director of finance, if you're a large distributed organization, right, maybe you have, or maybe you've grown by acquisition or something like that, maybe you have 2 different directors of finance or 5 directors of finance, but each of the directors is over a different segment of the business. So I work at GCA. My division is called IGA, Identity Governance Administration. It's where all the IDM gurus live. Maybe my director of finance over my group is different from GCA's training division. So depending on who is asking for the access, it's going to, if I'm in the training group, it's going to go to the director of finance for training. If I'm in the IGA group, it's going to go to the director of finance for the IGA group. It is relative to who's asking. Another great example is manager, right? That's the easiest example. If we want your direct report or your direct manager to sign off, that's pretty simple. We'll just go straight to your manager, and everybody's going to potentially have a different one. After we've satisfied all of our approval patterns, and one thing to keep in mind is in NetIQ Identity Manager, there is a default out-of-the-box flow that gets assigned, but you can change the flow, and you can also change the approver list on an item-by-item basis. So you have that flexibility. It's not like other tools where you define one approval pattern. That approval pattern is applicable to the entire catalog of access. In this case, each individual item, we have the blanket broad brush, apply this to everything, but then we can go back and on an individual basis, we can tweak it and change it slightly. That's a very powerful capability. After we've determined that we've gotten all the approvals done for whatever access we've requested, it's time to move to fulfillment. In fulfillment, I tried to do a quick mock-up. It's a little bit, it's not that it's complicated, but it shows the entire process, right? So here at the top, there's 2 ways that you can access IDM. IDM has a web browser interface that you can go to, the IDM dashboard. You can go in and do things through there. However, there is a RESTful API, so you can do this via integration capabilities programmatically if you desire. Larger organizations, we've had experience, they like to use the REST API because they will do, for example, they will onboard they'll do M&A, right? So we just ran off and we bought a company that has 25,000 people. What I don't want to do is go into a web-based interface for 25,000 people and request 10 accounts per person individually. That sounds very painful to me. So what I can do is I can use some programmatic logic to iterate through programmatically and automate the process of kicking off the request using the RESTful interface as I desire. Whether it comes through the web browser or the RESTful interface, it still goes through the same 3 steps. First, you do the request, then it goes through the approval process, and then it goes out for fulfillment. So what I've expanded in this slide right here with the blue boxes is the 3 sections of fulfillment. Microfocus or NetIQ, out of the box, they have dozens upon dozens of pre-configured connectors for you to leverage. From the very generic ones, such as CSV or file, delimited text, however you want to call it, JDBC to talk to any database, SOAP, REST, Active Directory and LDAP, and then even application ones, SAP, Oracle, PeopleSoft, Workday, etc. They have their catalog of connectors. However, if you have an application, and many organizations do, right, there'll be an application that is maybe vertical specific or industry specific or something like that. So it's not seen enough in the wild, and NetIQ hasn't created a connector yet. That's where we can go into this section of custom connectors. That's where we can either take one of the generic ones like CSV file or JDBC, or there's an SDK that we can use, and we can create a native connector for you. GCA is very good at that. We've been doing that for years. And then there's the third category. When it doesn't make sense from a return on investment standpoint to automate provisioning to a system, then don't. Let's create an integration over to your ticketing system. And then what we can potentially do is take 20, 30, 50, 100 applications all in one fell swoop and brush them in. One of the fatal errors that I see most organizations still making to this day is the roles catalog within their identity management system only consists of things that they can automate provisioning to. They don't give consideration to things that go through the ticketing system. So the organization has a split when it comes to requests. Depending on what you're asking for, you either go to the IAM system and put in the request over there, or you go into an ITSM system like ServiceNow, Remedy, or one of those tools, and you put the request in on that side. There's no reason to, we could still do that. You could still go in and one-off ask for things. But if I have a new employee who's starting and they're in sales, and they're supposed to have all the accounts that we talked about, but why can't I put laptop, cell phone, key to the office, parking decal, building access card, like a prox card to swipe in order to get into the building? All of those things are tickets in the ITSM system. If I'm hiring a new employee and I know that they're at the Tampa office, I know they need a decal to park in the garage, a key to the office, a building access card to unlock the door to get into the building, a physical handset on their phone, and a laptop to work on. Why don't I just open those tickets when they get hired? We can do that with service desk integration. So now, when the new employee starts, it'll automate provisioning up here with the connector, the logical systems that it automates provisioning to, and then it'll automatically open tickets in the ticketing system for all of the things that IDM cannot automatically do. So that's the full provisioning process and how we leverage roles in it. I don't see any questions in the chat as of yet. Don't be shy. Feel free to ask questions as I go. The next step is user access reviews. It's the piece that almost people either forget them because they haven't been hit over the head with regulatory compliance, or it's the first thing on their mind because they've been hit over the head with regulatory compliance. I found this comic strip on the internet, and I think it is one of the best examples of user access reviews, especially at the bottom. Almost every organization, when they first get tasked to do user access reviews, the first thing that they try to do is they say, okay, step one, we need to have everybody reattest. So there are dozens upon dozens upon dozens of spreadsheets. So if you look at the top here, I'm not sure if everybody can read it, but up here at the top, I'm pulling control reports out of 200 spreadsheets and 75 emails so I can see them all in one document, right? They're trying to correlate together all of the data to see who has access to what, because that's ultimately what a user access review is doing. Then they're sending them out via emails, asking people to go through these spreadsheets and respond back. And then they've got to grab their baseball bat and walk around and threaten to, crack kneecaps or something like that in order to get them to actually respond back to that email. And now you have the organization down here at the bottom, right, who they're going through all of these different emails and, potentially thousands of lines on them to determine who has access. That's the way that it works. Then on the other side of that same equation, right, the external auditor comes in and says, Robert Ivy has access to log into Blue Jeans. Why? That's probably not a great example for regulatory compliance because who cares that I have access to Blue Jeans? Well, let's just say that Blue Jeans had some, mystical, magical, intellectual property that GCA doesn't want to get out the door. So now our auditors are saying, hey, Robert, or hey, Damon, why does Robert have access? And Damon says, oh, well, they asked for access, and now that, whoever's on the ticketing system has to dig up and find that email where Damon said it was okay. Robert has access because Damon said so, right? All that evidence gathering is a nightmare. One of the reasons why this is helpful, just in general, having automated provisioning that goes through this request engine. Remember, every single time we get an approval, we document it, and the reporting module has a pre-canned report. So if you're running through a provisioning engine like Identity Manager, and someone asks you the question, why does Robert have access to Blue Jeans? All you have to do is go over and say, there's a few out of the box reports depending on which one you want. You can either run a report on everything that Robert has and who approved it. Click, here you go. Or you can run a report on everybody who has access to Blue Jeans and who approved it. Either way, we can pivot on who the person is that you're asking about, or we can pivot on on the application. This way, typically, if you've gone through this process, an auditor walks in the door and says, there's 10,000 provisioning actions that have occurred. They go through and they grab a sample, maybe 1,000 of them, and say, give me access on these, this 10%. Show me all of the evidence to support it. My preference is to click one button and provide all of the evidence for all 10,000. I don't want to run around like they are down at the bottom of this diagram trying to find the specific items that the auditor is asking for. What I want to do is provide all of the evidence for all 10,000 of the actions that have been taken, every single thing, and say, here's everything. Your 1,000 are in here somewhere. What is the benefit of doing this, or not the benefit, but the strategy? Where does roles fit into this category? It's actually pretty simple. When I do user access reviews for organizations, what do I put in front of the reviewer? If I have birthright roles, which is the top, that's a role that is granted because we said so. GCA employees get these 5 things because they're employees. I don't even have to review that. Well, I do, but I don't have to. Right now at GCA, I have 14 direct reports. So if GCA were running a user access review, and I know that every single one of my 14 direct reports has each of the 5 items that were contained within that role, right? A network account, a box account, a G Suite account, an Office 365 account, and a RingCentral account. That means I have to review 70 items right there. Here's 14 people that report to me. Here's 70 things. Each of them have 5. 14 times 5 is 70. Why? Well, you want an attestation. That's what user access review is. You want an attestation from me as their manager saying, yes, that access is appropriate for them. Well, if I had just done it as a requested role here in the middle, right? So I requested the employee role for everybody. I just went from 70 items down to 14, right? Now I don't have to say, yes, they need for each of the 5. I can say, yes, they're still employees. They still need those 5 things. I only have to click one button each, so 14 times. But if we made it a birthright role, and Jim Quash, as president and CEO of GCA, said, yep, every single employee gets this, all I have to do is have him reattest that statement. Jim, is that still accurate? Now, all 14 of my direct reports, that one role times 5 things that each role contains, I don't have to reattest it. Jim clicked one button. Yes, all employees of GCA get this stuff. I don't have to do anything for those things because we already have it, right? We have an attestation from at the top that trickles all the way down my organization that says that it is appropriate for every employee at this organization to have this. And as you go through each of my 14 direct reports, it'll say that they are a full-time employee. According to HR, that's authoritative. I don't need to review that. It's been reviewed. We're done. So then there's the one-offs, the requested roles. So what do we do with these? Well, the first thing we want to do with those is say, okay, well, you requested it, you got it. So this is an attestation that says it's still appropriate for you. So let's go ahead and do it. But if you go back to my remote Cerner physician example, every remote Cerner physician gets access to 7 individual items and that compromises their access that gets them into Cerner. So instead of putting 7 line items in front of somebody to say, hey, are these things still appropriate? We're just going to put 1. Is it still appropriate for them to be able to remote in and access Cerner as a physician? Yes or no? The answer is yes. Good. The second thing we want to do when we have requested roles such as that is we want to do a quick evaluation. We have role mining capabilities baked into some of the tools. So we just want to ask a very simple question. Are we doing this as a one-off for everybody? Is every single remote physician have this access? If that's the case, why don't we just automatically assign it? Why don't we move it up and make it a birthright role? And then the last piece is the non-role related granular rights. Ultimately, we want to move away from that. We want to make it to where, hey, here's your these granular rights are all become compromised of a role. We want to know a business function that you're doing, not a specific right that you have. You have those rights because they're required by a business function. So we want to go ahead and we still want to review them because we've got to review everything, but then we want to mine them to see if we can find a combination that looks like a role. Are we putting together certain combinations? Do we need to modify an existing role to include this because everybody has it? And then if we do create a new role out of it, we can also then evaluate if we need to, does it go in requested roles or birthright roles? Do we need to move it up? Ultimately, the goal when it comes to user access reviews that we're doing with roles is we're trying to obfuscate what the individual granular stuff is from a business stakeholder. We want them to be approving whether or not you can perform a specific business function, not what granular rights you have. The granular rights are specifically there and evaluated to allow you to perform a business function. The stakeholder within the business who's reviewing just needs to be reviewing whether or not you should be allowed to perform that function. And then finally, what are we trying to strive for? Ultimately, if we can get to 80% of rights being provisioned with birthright roles, that means, let me translate that in user access review language. If we're assigning 80% of your rights with birthright roles, we've reduced 80% of the things that need to be reviewed in your user access review. Then when we get to requested roles, we want the requested roles to be nice and pretty. When I say pretty, we want to have this in business speak. I want a role to essentially look like a business function. That way when we're asking for something, what are you trying to do within my business? That's the question we're asking. And when we're reviewing it on the user access review side, we want to say, this blob of access is enabling this business function. Should this person be allowed to do accounts receivable functions? Now, what accounts receivable, if they want to expand it, they can see it, but I don't want them to have to go through and approve specific Active Directory groups or specific roles within Acumatica or whatever the accounting system is. I don't want them to have to go in and know all that grant, because that requires the stakeholder within the business to know IT lingo. It's a different language. I want to translate that language into business speak and put it in front of them in business speak so they can say, no, Robert does not do accounts receivable functions. Take it away. Yes, Dan Quashis does do accounts receivable functions. Let him have that. That's the end of the presentation. I haven't seen any questions coming in yet, but I welcome your questions. In fact, I encourage them. No questions, huh? Anybody? You can take yourself off of mute and ask it via ask it.
It looks like there was one question. Hold on one second. Let me see. No, it was. Oh no, that wasn't. I'm sorry.
Okay. Does anybody have a question?
Well, I know we have a few people here who are visiting. Thanks again, Robert. You did an excellent job. And so what we want to do is basically raffle off our Amazon gift card that was promised. And the winner of that gift card will be Chad Lackinen. And you'll get an email in your email with the gift certificate and all the information. I want to thank everybody for coming out to the webinar today. If you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to the salesperson who invited you. If you'd like to set up an appointment for a one-on-one with Robert, they can arrange that. Again, we want to thank everyone for joining us today, and have a good day.